Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Bet Avichai. I would like to ask everyone to please turn off your mobile devices. We are now at the second lecture in our series, Jerusalem and the Temple, from creation to destruction and beyond. The lecture this evening will be on the topic, Rebuilding and Restoring. Three major stages in the history of the Second Temple of Jerusalem. I am pleased to invite Professor Gafni. Professor Gafni is a Professor Emeritus of Jewish History in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Gafni, please.
Okay. We have to cover approximately 600 years today, and so I'll have to talk very fast. The introduction mentioned the topic for today, and that is the three stages, or the three different consecrations, rebuilding, rededication of the Second Temple. The Second Temple wasn't just set up once in the Persian period to remain until the Romans destroy it. We have at least, as I said, three cases where there was a dedication, or a rededication, or a reconsecration, or rebuilding of the temple. Those three stages, I could actually give you dates, but I know that that's passé. I'm a historian. We don't deal with dates anymore. But if anybody is writing them down, and these are the last dates, well, I shouldn't make promises like that, but almost the last dates that I'll mention today. The first is the month of March, 515 BCE. That, of course, is the consecration of the Second Temple for the first time, following the Cyrus Declaration that we'll talk about in a few minutes. In other words, the Second Temple opens its doors in the year 515, some say 516, but we won't go into that, BCE. The second restoration that I'll be talking about this evening is the one under the Hasmoneans, or commonly referred to as the Maccabees. Specifically under Judah Maccabee, Chanukah of the year 164 BCE. The third consecration of the temple, which actually followed a rebuilding of the temple, takes place under King Herod. The process itself of building that temple, or rebuilding the temple under Herod, began in the year 2019 BCE and was concluded about a year and a half later in the year 17 BCE, at least the main structure of the temple. What I'm going to suggest, however, is that each of these three stages contain a lot more than just the opening of the doors of a restored temple. Each of them suggests a new type of Jewish leadership, a new type of communal activity linked to the temple. And it's only when we examine this gradual development over a period of centuries that we can truly understand much of Second Temple Jewish history. I'd like to begin, and I think this is the obvious place to begin, by reading the famous Declaration of Cyrus. This really opens up the Second Temple period. It's a declaration that was issued before the consecration of the Second Temple. You have it in front of you, source number 1. The declaration itself, and we'll talk about its authenticity. The declaration was issued 1 year after Cyrus had finally defeated the Babylonian Empire, Nabonidus. That was in 539. And in 538, he issues, according to the book of Ezra, the following edict. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, "The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Any one of you, all his people, may God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem that is in Judah and build the house of the Lord God of Israel, the God that is in Jerusalem. And all who stay behind wherever they may be living, let the people of that place, those people that stay behind, assist him who is going up with silver, gold, goods, livestock, besides the free will offering to the house of God that is in Jerusalem. So Cyrus, the new king of Persia, grants Jews permission to do something. Now, this is very important. What did he not grant? This is not the Balfour Declaration. And this is a point that's very often overlooked. And I can show you many people who try to compare the two. There's absolutely no mention here of the restoration of a national homeland, of the granting of political independence, or even political autonomy. Permission is granted to build a house in Jerusalem. And this line is critical for understanding all of subsequent Second Temple history. Not only does the period begin with the temple, but very quickly it becomes apparent that we are to come and recognize for the first time a new type of Jewish leadership, a carryover, of course, from the first temple, but now granted with far greater powers. And I'm talking, of course, about the priesthood. But before we get to the issue of priesthood, one question has to be asked: is the Cyrus Declaration authentic? And you know there's tons of literature that deal with the question of authenticity. We have another version, by the way, at the end of the book of Chronicles, but I decided to read this version. There were authors in the 19th century, there were scholars in the 19th century, who were convinced that this is a forgery, that this was in fact produced by Jews and not by Cyrus as a means of legitimizing the very existence of a Jewish temple. In other words, we were granted permission to build a temple by the powers that existed at the time in the Middle East, and so this is a legitimate structure. And the proof that was often used to support the claim of forgery was the reference to God. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, "The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth." The Lord God of heaven? Cyrus is a Persian pagan who believes in a whole pantheon of Iranian gods. And so would he have used the phrase, "the Lord God of heaven"? However, we will see in just a minute that Cyrus does the very same thing when he writes, again, some sort of a declaration to another religious community, the Babylonians. And he tells them, "Marduk, the great god of the world, appointed me to give you back your temples." And so what we have here is a ruse that will repeat itself for hundreds and hundreds of years, wherein kings or emperors later on, in addressing particular national entities or national religious entities, will use the name of God that is familiar to the addressees. And by the way, one very famous example takes place in the 4th century of the Common Era, Julian the Apostate. He is the famous emperor, the anti-Christian emperor, who was totally devoted to the pagan pantheon of the Romans. And yet when he writes the Jews saying, as Cyrus did, "I'm going to give you the opportunity to build the temple again," he refers to God as, again, the Almighty God who with his right hand gave me permission to do the following. Julian does exactly the same thing that Cyrus does. Now, nevertheless, as I said, some people would claim this is a forgery. That in and of itself, the fact that the Lord God of heaven might have been used by a pagan, doesn't prove the authenticity. It may not undergird the claim of falsification, of forgery. Can we go a step further to prove that the declaration, in fact, maintains a degree, or much more than that, of truth? number 2, we're going to skip over number 2, I'll just read it very quickly. We have another addition to Cyrus's decree, a memorandum in the first year of King Cyrus. King Cyrus issued an order concerning the house of God in Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, a place for offering sacrifices, with a base built up high. Let it be 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide. And now comes a very interesting addition. The expenses shall be paid by the palace. And this sets in motion a precedent that will be copied later on by Hellenistic kings, by Roman emperors, almost until the destruction of the Second Temple. The temple in Jerusalem would receive support, not sole support, we'll talk about support later on, but will receive support by whatever authorities might be in control of the land of Judea at any given time, be they Persians, Hellenistic rulers, later on Roman emperors. But it could be that a discovery made in the late 19th century, 1879, in the ancient city of Babylon might, I think, add a greater degree of authenticity, or at least of likelihood of authenticity, to the Cyrus Declaration. In the year 1879, scholars found what you see here, a picture here, source number 3, a cylinder, a clay cylinder with cuneiform Akkadian text on it. And it was a declaration made by Cyrus to the Babylonians. And rather than just describe it, why don't we read it very quickly? I took just a portion of the text. The text itself, by the way, today, like all other stolen artifacts, is in the British Museum. It kind of fell into bits and pieces. However, there's a copy of the cylinder in, of all places, the entrance to the United Nations, I think it's a Security Council building in New York, because it was perceived to be the first Charter of Independence ever issued in antiquity. One can argue with that. And indeed, if it was a Charter of Independence, I don't know, I could think of better places to put it. Nevertheless, Cyrus says as follows: an incompetent person, meaning Nabonidus. Now, Nabonidus was the last Babylonian king, and he ruled literally until 539, when he was conquered by Cyrus, this upstart Persian ruler. And so he says that Nabonidus was installed to exercise lordship over his country, meaning Babylonia and the whole empire, whole Babylonian empire. Irreverently, he put an end to the regular offerings, and he interfered in cultic centers. He did away with the worship of Marduk, the king of gods. Now, this is wonderful. Here, Marduk, the Babylonian god, suddenly becomes the king of gods, but we saw just a few minutes ago that who is the real God of heaven? It's the Jewish God. So you see the game here, right? You refer to the God of the addressees, right, in a name that they would find familiar. Okay. He did away with the worship of Marduk, the king of gods. Marduk then took a righteous king, his favorite by the hand. He called out his name, and you can guess who that is, right? Cyrus. He pronounced his name to be king all over the world. And now Cyrus talks in first person. I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, mighty king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, the son of Cambyses. When I entered Babylon in a peaceful manner, Marduk, the great Lord, established as his fate for me a magnanimous heart of one who loves Babylon. And I daily attended to his worship. I sought the wealth. See, now, of course, you realize Babylon, Iraq, is much closer to where Cyrus is situated than Jerusalem. So whereas in Jerusalem, he sends people to worship on his behalf, here he claims he actually went to the temple of Marduk. I sought the welfare of the city of Babylon and all its sacred centers. As for this, now comes the important part. As for the citizens of Babylon, I relieved their weariness, freed them from their service. I returned the images of the gods who had resided there, meaning in Babylon, to their places, and let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned them to their dwellings. In addition, at the command of Marduk, the great Lord, I settled in their habitations and pleasing abodes the gods of Sumer and Akkad, whom Nabonidus, to the anger of the Lord of gods, had brought into Babylon. In other words, what we know is Cyrus's policy towards conquered peoples under the Persians. And the policy was one of tolerance, of restoration, of restoring the ancient cults that had been annihilated or shut down by the previous Babylonian Empire. And now Cyrus opens this up. Does this prove the authenticity of the Cyrus Declaration in Ezra? We can't say it proves the authenticity. What we can say is that it dovetails perfectly. In other words, it renders the declaration certainly fitting. It fits in perfectly in the policies that Cyrus seems to be embracing throughout the new Persian Empire. Now, of course, the one thing we can't expect to find in our declaration is that he gave permission to do what? To return the gods back home to the temple, because there are no gods in the Jewish temple, right? In other words, physical entities. But we have the next best thing, if you look at source number 4. And the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple that was in Jerusalem, brought into the temple of Babylon, these Cyrus the king took out of the temple of Babylon. And they were delivered to one whose name was Sheshbazzar. Sheshbazzar is a descendant of the Davidic family, the royal family. We're not too sure. Is it a son of Yehoiachin or is it some other nephew? Nevertheless, clearly a Davidic representative, whom he made governor, right? And also in Ezra we read all the articles of gold and silver numbered 5,400. Sheshbazzar brought them up with the exiles. And so what we have here is activity attributed to Cyrus in our Bible that is very, very similar to what we know took place in other parts of the kingdom, in the new kingdom. And it's a fairly good assumption. There's no, I mean, if I were to take, if I had to make a decision, I would say, unless proven otherwise, right, I don't really think that there is reason to doubt at least the spirit of the Cyrus Declaration. Can we prove? It's very hard not to prove that what? That some Jewish intermediary reworded, as it were, Cyrus's declaration to make it be more amenable to Jewish ears. That's always a possibility. But nevertheless, this sets the Second Temple period into motion. And now I want to make a point. The Second Temple would be consecrated in the year 515 BCE. In other words, it doesn't happen overnight. The declaration takes place in 538, and then apparently there were snags along the way, and it takes over 20 years until it comes to fruition. Why? Well, one of the reasons is that the Persians themselves were at war with the Egyptians during that period, and that may in itself have caused delay and maybe even the cessation of financial support for the rebuilding of the temple. But when we read in the last prophets of the Bible that people are worried, right? And the prophets have to encourage them, don't worry, the aura of the Second Temple will be greater than the first, etc., etc. You get a sense of apprehension before the Second Temple was finally completed. It was completed under the leadership of two Jewish personalities, and they are Zerubbabel, another descendant of the Davidic family, and Yehoshua ben Yehotzadak, the high priest. However, almost immediately after the opening of the Second Temple, the consecration of the Second Temple, Zerubbabel, the descendant of the Davidic house, vanishes. And he just doesn't appear anymore in our sources. We don't know where he went. It could very well be, and many scholars are convinced that this is what happened, is that yes, Cyrus may have offered them religious freedom, but Jews may have interpreted it as being the beginning of a national revival as well. Remember, the prophets refer to even Cyrus himself as Re'i, my ally, and also as Mashiach in one place. And it could be that they saw Zerubbabel, a descendant of the house of David, as being the ultimate restorer of the Davidic monarchy. And that far, the Persians were not willing to go. They were not about to grant political autonomy or independence. And it could be that they removed Zerubbabel from the scene, The fact is he is removed, one way or another, we don't know how, right? But he vanishes. And the central person to remain after that, until the arrival of Ezra and Nehemiah some decades later, and we won't go into that chapter, the central figure is the high priest. And here I'd like to make a point, and this is critical for understanding all of Second Temple history. I used to play a game with my students. I would tell them, in the First Temple period, we recognize three types of Jewish leadership. There were kings, there were prophets, and there were priests. And my first question to them would always be, in the First Temple period, of those three elements, which is the least obvious and possibly also the least potent, right, on the scene? Exactly. And clearly, the kings would not be the first choice. The kings are the ones who control the political events and the military activity of the nation. The prophets are certainly available to us. In other words, they're on the scene, and we simply know them by the books with their names attached to them. What do we know about the priests of the First Temple period, and certainly of the high priests? And so I would play a game, and I would ask them, "Can you name 5 kings of the First Temple?" And of course I said, beginning with the temple. In other words, you can't name David; he's known, right? It has maybe Solomon, okay, but we can all name 5 kings. You can certainly name 5 prophets. All you have to do is say Isaiah, Amos, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and you're there. But then I would ask them, now, can anybody name 5 high priests for me from the First Temple period? And there would usually be sort of deathly quiet in the room. People they were kind of embarrassed, right? And they start reading their notes or whatever it is that they're reading. But I found out that that's a dangerous question, because invariably in the audience is last year's Bible champion, right? One of these walking concordances, and I could hear him mentally flipping through the concordance to priests, high, right? And he raises his hand, right? Yes, there were 7 that are mentioned, and they are the following, right? Having been burnt, and more than once, I realized I have to come with a follow-up question. And so my follow-up question is, wonderful. You've named all 6 or all 7, and they're mentioned there. Now tell me, what did they do? Because while 1 or 2 of them were involved in palace intrigue, and there are some stories like that, 1 or 2 or 3 stories actually like that, the fact is that the high priest is usually mentioned as one of the officials of the king. The king had serving under him, right, a scribe and a priest and a general and so on. And the priest is simply an official mentioned very often together with the other officials. As I say, save for a few, there are limited examples. But remember, the First Temple stood, according to our biblical chronology, for 410 years. And if I can't name more than a few priests for a 400-year period, that tells me that they're just not that obvious on the scene. When you get to the Second Temple period, this changes radically. And what you find is, well, first of all, as I said, monarchy no longer exists, and certainly the Persians saw to that already. Prophecy. The rabbis, in a very interesting chronological book known as Seder Olam, describe the end of prophecy taking place as Alexander the Great comes on the scene. In other words, in the crossover period from the Persian to the Hellenistic period, meaning 4th century BCE, prophecy as an ongoing phenomenon ceases. That is not to say that the rabbis are not aware of certain people having some sort of divine inspiration and maybe hearing even a bat kol, and they do claim that a number of cases of a bat kol appeared during the Second Temple period, and even in the temple 1 or 2 times. But I'm talking about the ongoing phenomenon of prophecy no longer exists. As a result, the priesthood now, beginning with the opening of the Second Temple, assumes a far greater role and a far more central role in the leadership of the Jewish people. And this will explain subsequent phenomena that we're going to encounter today. For instance, is it by chance that the leaders of the uprising against Antiochus Epiphanes were priests? Mattathias and his sons? Not all. Not only, but it's more than that. It's not only that they were priests, but even when they founded a kingdom, probably under Alexander Jannaeus Yanai, if you look at the coins that they struck, you'll find something very interesting. Jannaeus, for instance, struck coins that have both Greek and Hebrew or Aramaic on them. In Greek, he calls himself Alexandros Basileos, Alexander the King. In Hebrew, he calls himself Yonatan Kohen Gadol. And that's very telling. In other words, the role that he, Yanai, knew would be most meaningful to Jews is Kohen Gadol. Basileos, king, that's for external consumption. And so we're setting, as I say, a pattern here already in the Persian period that is going to carry through. When we get to Herod, no, of course, Herod can't be priest. He was king. But what does he do? And maybe we'll get to this at the very end of our talk. He is very careful to appoint the high priests. He controls the high priesthood because he knows that it is through high priesthood that he has a hands-on control of the Jewish community. And Jews knew this as well. So that the first sources that we read about regarding the establishment of the Second Temple are not just sort of a window into what happened on the Temple Mount, but really what is taking place now within the community at large. Now, one or two other events have to be... by the way, just to prove my point, you remember last week we met that Greek author Hecataeus of Abdera. He was the fellow that gave us the first report about Moses establishing Jerusalem, and he was actually pretty positive. And I told you that in his case, some people doubt whether it was actually written by the Greek author, Hecataeus. It's just too good. And some scholars claim that it might have been written by a Jew. But he talks about the Second Temple in a very interesting way. If you skip to source number 7, this dovetails perfectly with what I just said about the role of the priesthood. He describes Moses. Moses, picked out the men of most refinement and with the greatest ability to lead the nation and appointed them priests. And in other words, he didn't just appoint the house of Levi and of Aaron. No, he appointed the people of greatest refinement and appointed them priests. And he ordained that they should occupy themselves with the temple and the honors and the sacrifices offered to God. Well, this can be based on the Bible. But let's go further. These same men he appointed to be judges in all major disputes and entrusted to them the guardianship of the laws and customs. Okay, so far there's nothing terribly striking here. You could say it doesn't quite fit the Torah, but it's not that far removed. But now comes an interesting line. For this reasons, the Jews never have a king. And authority over the people is regularly vested in whichever priest is regarded as superior to his colleagues in wisdom and virtue. They call this man the high priest. The Jews never have a king? So the Jewish forger of Hecataeus never read his Bible? Now, what might the solution be? First of all, it could be that Hecataeus is the author. He doesn't know Bible firsthand. Maybe he visited Jerusalem and saw that the priests were the central functionaries, and that might be an explanation that we'll see in a second. Or it could be, right, that, again, remember, Hecataeus is writing the history of ancient Israel to fit the ethnographic menu of how you describe an ancient nation. And for the real Greeks, the true Greeks, not the Macedonians, the true Greeks were very proud of what? The fact that they abolished the monarchy ages ago. We have a demokratia, right? And not a monarchy. And so it could be that whoever is writing this wants to look good in Greek eyes and to sound good in Greek ears. And so he says, we also never had a king. We never used that base system of rule, but rather always vested in our leadership in the wisest among us. Now, it could even be further. They called this man the high priest and believed that he acts as a messenger to them of God's commandments. Now comes a very wonderful description. It is terrible typo here. It is he, we are told, who in their assemblies and other gatherings announces what is ordained, and the Jews are so docile in such matters that straight away they fall to the ground and do reverence to the high priest when he expounds the commandments to them. What's going on here? Unless I assume maybe Hecatius, or whoever is writing this in the name of Hecatius, visited Jerusalem on the Day of Atonement, right? He was told he can't go up to the Temple Mount because, he actually shouldn't have even been in the temple compound if he was not Jewish, but he snuck in. You know, there were signs around the Temple Mount. You can see one of them today if you go to Istanbul in the museum, but don't go these days. You take a little time. And there's another portion of a sign here in Jerusalem. There were signs in Greek around the temple, around the whole area, saying foreigners, meaning non-Jews, may not go beyond this spot, and if they do, it is at the risk of their own life. Nevertheless, whoever did this may have snuck in on the Day of Atonement. And what does he see? He sees the high priest standing there, and I'm sure many of you are already making the association. Right? When they heard the sacred name coming forth from the mouth of the high priest, they immediately bowed down. So if you know your Hebrew, you know that they're bowing down when they hear the name of God, right? But if you're a tourist that doesn't know any Hebrew, all you see is a high priest saying something, and immediately everybody bowing down. Ergo, they must be bowing down to that person speaking, who is the high priest. Again, we don't know what the origin of Hecatius' description is, but it fits perfectly what I've claimed, and that is the centrality of the priesthood in the Second Temple period. In other words, Hecatius is a perfect mirror of this new reality that the Persian period brings in. One other aspect of the temple that is critical for understanding all of subsequent Second Temple history, and that's in source number 5. Nehemiah tells us, also we made ordinances for us to charge ourselves yearly with the third part of a shekel for the service of the house of our God. This is the first case, this is the first example where we hear of what? Of a public, organized support system for the temple. We don't find this in the First Temple. We don't know who supported all of the activity. We assume it's the monarchy, and it could be donors that came during the First Temple period, bringing gifts. We have no real hard information about support of the First Temple. The system of shkalim that appears in the book of Exodus, right, Kiti, Sa'ad, Roshman, and so on, doesn't talk about first of all, there's no temple yet in the days of the Torah, but it doesn't establish a fixed system of support. Later on, of course, those texts will be used for the function of what we call the half shekel, machatzit shekel, and this will be highly developed in the Second Temple period. It begins with Nehemiah. Of course, with Nehemiah, a third shekel was sufficient, but inflation being what it is, right? Who knows, it may have expanded into half a shekel. But here we encounter for the first time a conscious effort of rendering the temple the people's temple, and one way of achieving that is by having all of the people donate to that temple a fixed amount. They are all equal in that payment. And we're going to see this maybe later on. He then goes on, Nehemiah, to describe not just the third of a shekel, and the showbread, and the meat offerings, and so on, and the feasts, right, are all brought to the house of our God, and so on. And if you read Nehemiah, we don't have time to do this, but if you read Nehemiah later, you'll find that even those offerings that could be given to your neighboring Levite at home, not in Jerusalem, but wherever you might be living, because you all know you give a first offering to a priest, truma, and then you give a tithe to the Levite. That can be done anywhere. And yet, beginning already with Nehemiah, you find that many of those gifts are brought to the temple, which is not what the Torah requires originally. But this is going to be an interesting process. We're going to hear that in Hasmonean times, right, this was enhanced, and John Hyrcanus would actually send messengers around the country to enforce this tithing and also to bring back these offerings to the temple in Jerusalem. And just one last point before we get to the next stage. Right? As I said, I tried to divide our talk today into 3 equal portions, but it's not going to work. Okay. Source number 6 tells us something else about the history of Jerusalem. Nehemiah says to the people, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. In other words, yes, there's a temple, but the city is a mess. There's no defense system. There's a sparse population in Jerusalem, right? Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that way we may no longer suffer derision. If you want to see part of the wall, go to Ir David, right? Go to that enclave there, and you can see precisely those areas that were established during the presence of Nehemiah in Jerusalem, right? And then so the wall was built, and then we hear something else. And the princes of the people dwelt in Jerusalem. The rest of the people also cast lots to bring 1 of 10 to dwell in Jerusalem, the holy city, and 9 parts in the other cities. And the people, all the men that willingly offered themselves to dwell in Jerusalem, etc., etc. In other words, Nehemiah takes care of 2 things, the defense of Jerusalem and the population of Jerusalem, by claiming, or by demanding actually, that 10% of the Judean population, right, must move or reside in Jerusalem. So much for the Persian period. The fact is that after the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, we know precious little about what's taking place in Jerusalem and the temple during most of the Persian period. It's one of the great dark holes, as it were, of Jewish history. So much so that ultimately there were those who kind of collapsed the Second Temple period, and this already appears in ancient chronology, including some rabbinic sources that talk about all of the Persian period being 34 years, even though we know that it was a lot closer to 200 years, right? Until Alexander the Great, until 333, if we want BCE. And so we really have very, very little information. We have made some discoveries, but regarding the temple, our knowledge is very scanty, very, very limited. But then we come to the Hellenistic period. So you should have page number 3 in front of you. Now, we do have some sources that talk about Jerusalem in the early Hellenistic period. One of those sources is the famous Jerusalem priestly poet, Ben Sira, or Ecclesiasticus. And I quoted just one little portion from Ben Sira, which again tells you what has changed. Look at his paean to the leaders of the people. Who comes next to God? Number 8. Fear God with all thy heart, and reverence his priests. With all thy strength love him that made thee, forsake not his ministers. Glorify God, honor the priests, and give them their portion as it is commanded thee. Now, it might be by chance that Ben Sira is also a priest, right? So this is a terrible pun, he has a vested interest in this. Forgive me. But he was not only a priest, he was a rich priest. He was part of the Jerusalem aristocracy. And if you read the book of Ben Sira, you get this sense of this Jerusalem priestly aristocracy also being the intellectual powers of Jerusalem. In fact, Ben Sira even has one line that grates on us, that it's hard for us who are really students of the later rabbis, right, of Hillel and Yochanan ben Zakkai, right, who open up the gates of learning to everyone, right, and yet Ben Sira says, it's really only rich people like me that can handle learning. because the poalim, right, the artisans and the farmers are too busy in the fields. They have no time for the serious stuff. So let them do what they do well, and that's grow things and so on, and we'll take care of intellectual activity. And as I say, we feel kind of uncomfortable when you read a line like that, right, because of how we have been, as it were, cultivated. But that is the atmosphere. The priesthood was the central factor. As a result, the introduction to the Hasmonean uprising, and this is important, is not at first connected to evil decrees of Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Once upon a time there was, and we all have different versions of how the Hasmonean or Maccabean uprising took place and how Hanukkah happened, and it all really depends on which Ganenet you had in your youth, right? So, Ganenet Miriam had her version and Ganenet Rivka had hers, right? And no two were the same, ever. Trust me, I've studied this very seriously, right? But the point is that almost all of them are mistaken by assuming that once upon a time there was a wicked king and his name was Antiochus Epiphanes, and he instituted these terrible anti-religious decrees against the Jews, and they rose up in rebellion against him. That's not what happened. Yes, there were decrees, but they come at the second stage. The first stage of the Hasmonean uprising takes place as a result of changes in the establishment of Jerusalem that had existed since the Persian period. Somebody starts to interfere in the workings of the priesthood, in the workings of the temple, and ultimately changes the very character of the city of Jerusalem. And this would be the first, I think, catalyst for at least a mini uprising that then, right, explodes into the ultimate Hasmonean uprising and the reestablishment, the reconsecration of the temple. Look at source number 9. This is the very beginning of the second book of Maccabees. The story of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, and the purification of the great temple, and the dedication of the altar, and further the wars of Antiochus Epiphanes. The author tells us, this is what I'm going to tell you now in this book, so that though few in number, they seized the whole land, right, and pursued, in other words, the Maccabees, they seized the whole land and pursued the barbarian hordes. By the way, this is a unique trick of the second book of Maccabees. He does something very interesting. You all know that the Greeks referred to the rest of the world, anyone who did not speak, anyone who was not Hellenismos, was barbaroi. If you didn't speak Greek, you were a barbarian. Why? Because you opened up your mouth, and what was elicited? Bar, 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 bar. That's what the Greeks heard. And that, of course, is the original meaning of barbarian. So the Greeks called the non-Greeks barbarians. What does the second book of Maccabees do? He turns it upside down. Who are the real barbarians? They're the Greeks fighting against us. And I might tell you, this is something which really most people don't know. The first appearance of the word Hellenism as a cultural ethnic phenomena, but mostly cultural. The first appearance of the word Hellenism as an ism is in the second book of Maccabees. But even more striking, the very first appearance of the word Judaism is in the second book of Maccabees. The first time where Judaismos appears as an ism, as a way of life, as a way of thinking, as a way of behavior, right? In other words, it is not a clash of two nations, but rather a clash of two ways of life, of two isms that appears in the second book of Maccabees for the first time. And what did they do? And I underlined this. And they recovered the temple famous throughout the world and freed the city. Now, this is interesting. Freed the city. As we will see, indeed, that was one of the causes of the uprising. It wasn't just the temple that had been usurped by the Hellenistic party. It was the entire city of Jerusalem. And for the author of 2 Maccabees, the city is critical. Why? 2 Maccabees was written in the Greek diaspora. The original author of 2 Maccabees was a fellow called Jason of Cyrene, North Africa, near Libya. It was ultimately abridged. It was originally in 5 volumes. It was abridged probably in Hellenistic Egypt, by a Jew in Hellenistic Egypt. for the Hellenists, for the Hellenistic ear. And the books, 2 Maccabees was written originally in Greek, not in Hebrew. 1 Maccabees was written in Hebrew, in Eretz Israel. 2 Maccabees is written for the Greek ear. And for the Greek ear, the city, the polis, is no less important than the temple. And so, yes, they recovered the temple, but they also recovered or restored the city and restored the laws. And now 2 Maccabees, beginning in source 10, gives us the introduction, the very introduction to the Hasmonean episode. And sure enough, it deals with a reform that was instituted in the city of Jerusalem. While the whole city was inhabited in unbroken peace, and the laws were well observed because of the piety of the high priest Onias. You see his first line, high priest Onias, everything is ideal, and he's preparing us. This now is about to be corrupted. This now is going to change, and that's the whole reason for the developments, the subsequent developments. It came about that the kings themselves, at first, honored the place and glorified the temple with the finest presents. Now, this is what I said before. Remember we saw how Cyrus sent presents to the temple? 2 Maccabees tells us that the Greek kings continued with this process. And we have another case of this mentioned elsewhere in Josephus. In other words, he says that at first they would send money to the temple as well. So that even Seleucus, the king of Asia, Asia meaning, of course, Asia is Asia Minor, is what we call Turkey today, defrayed from his own revenues all the expenses connected with the service of the sacrifices. In other words, here we have the Hellenistic king, Seleucus, situated. He's based in Syria, but he really controls all of the eastern conquests of Alexander the Great, not Egypt, right, but everything to the east. He supports this financially sacrificial worship in the temple. But now what happened? But a man named Simon of the tribe of... now here we have 2 versions. Some manuscripts read Benjamin, others Bilga. My late teacher, Menachem Stern, preferred Bilga because Bilga is a priestly family. Beit Bilga, and it's also referred to in the Talmud as being one of the families that led us into the Hasmonean uprising. So a captain of the temple, who had been captain of them, in other words, some officer of the temple, had a disagreement with the high priest. And when he could not prevail over Onias, he went to Apollonius of Tarsus. In other words, he went abroad to the Greek establishment and reported to him that the treasury in Jerusalem was full of untold sums of money, and it was possible for them to fall under the control of the king. And now, this is me talking here. Here follows the dispatch of Heliodorus. It's a wonderful story that opens 2 Maccabees. The Greek king hears that there's money in the temple, and you have to realize what happened here. He's going to send his emissary, Heliodorus, to break into the temple, to sack the temple, bring the money back to Syria. The Syrians were at various wars at the time and required this money. They had recently been defeated by the Romans, and they had to pay high taxes to the Roman Republic. And so they were in dire need of funds. And they were told, you've been sending all this money to Jerusalem on a yearly basis, and they haven't used up all the money, so come and take it. Based on this story, I have been telling my students for years now, if you ever get a grant or a fellowship, and you have to report at the end of the year, what happened to the money, never, under any circumstances, say that some money is still left, right? The only response should be, it wasn't enough. Right? And you see what happened to our fathers when somebody reported that indeed there's still money in the temple. This caused the whole Hasmonean episode. Right? And so they send an emissary, Heliodorus, who comes marching into Jerusalem. And there's a long description in 2 Maccabees how the whole city puts on sackcloth and is in mourning, and they're afraid of what's going to happen to the money, because it's not just the temple funds that are situated in the temple treasury, but it was also the Bank of Israel. And we're told that orphans and widows also had money deposited there. And he's about to break into the temple to take the money when an apparition suddenly appears. Some glorious horseman appears on this enormous, as it were, very, very impressive horse, strikes Heliodorus to the ground. Heliodorus faints, cannot remove anything from the temple Ultimately, he's revived. He goes back to Antioch, to the king, and the people there ask him, where's the money? And he says, look, tells the king, I don't have any money, but if there's anybody that you hate, send him there, right? I mean, it's pretty obvious what happened. The Jews were not willing to part with their funds so easily, and there was some opposition, but this turns into a miracle into Maccabees. And then the story ends, right? Heliodorus, because of the king's command, said that this money must in any case be confiscated. He enters the temple, nothing, no success. But something else happens. But again, my point being, the very first clash between Jews and Greeks is connected to the temple, to an attempt to sack the funds of the temple. Before any religious dispute, before any cultural dispute takes place, it's the temple. And now, if we read in source number 11, we see that this goes a step further. When Seleucus died, King Seleucus of the Seleucid Empire, the Greek Empire, Seleucus dies in 175 BCE, and Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom. And at that time, Jason, the brother of Onias, the high priest, his brother obtained the high priesthood by corruption, promising the king 360 talents of silver, and from another source of revenue, 80 talents. This is interesting. Suddenly the priesthood is up for grabs. And who makes the decision who will be the priest? The king, based on funds that were promised to him by the pretender to the priesthood, in this case, the brother of the high priest. This now is the second case of interference in the workings of the temple that is ultimately going to cause the uprising. So you see, it's not a clash of cultures here at first, but it's somebody tampering with the one element for which we do have total autonomy, and that is the temple and the priesthood. That now is being placed in question. But Jason went a step further, and this is important. Here comes a very difficult line. In addition to this, he, Jason, the new high priest, promised to pay 150 more talents if permission were given to establish by his authority a gymnasium and a body of youth for it. A gymnasium is a educational preparatory school for new young citizens of a polis who will join the army and then go into civil service, and the gymnasium is a major step in preparing the youth for that, and of course for athletic prowess as well. And so he received permission to establish a gymnasium and a body of youth for it, right? You need students. And now comes the difficult line. And to enroll the men of Jerusalem as Antiochians. What does that mean? And there's an enormous scholarly dispute about that line. It's a very vague line in Greek, hard to translate, and whatever translation you use, there are going to be problems. Some people claimed that you're setting up a new entity in the city of Jerusalem, and the establishment, the aristocracy of Jerusalem will now become citizens of Antioch in Syria, the capital city. Just as later on we find you can be a citizen of Rome even though you live in Judea or elsewhere in the empire. And so that was one explanation for this line. The only problem is that idea of becoming the citizen of a foreign capital city does not exist yet in the Hellenistic period. It only really comes forth during the Roman period. So that's out. Another attempt was to claim that a sort of inner community in Jerusalem was created, sort of an insular, I don't know what to call it. It's a lot more than a country club, right? It's some sort of a smaller group of the initiated, created some sort of institution that was named after the capital city of Antioch, and they would be Antiochians. However, most of us who studied at the Hebrew University were influenced by the late Professor Victor Cherikover. Some of you may have seen his book, Hellenistic Civilization and the Jews. Victor Cherikover taught Jewish history of the Hellenistic period at the Hebrew University in the 1940s and very early 50s, if I'm not mistaken, but certainly 1940s. And his interpretation was Jerusalem now was turned into a Greek polis called Antiochia. And so the establishment, the aristocracy of Jerusalem now became Antiochians, meaning citizens of the established polis of Antioch in Jerusalem. You have to understand, to establish a polis doesn't mean to build a city anew. The city continues as it existed. What you do is you introduce new institutions into the city. You build a gymnasium. You build a new hierarchy, right? A new establishment. As we saw, they're going to build a stadium or some sort of presence for athletic events as well. In other words, you refashion the structure, the organizational structure of the city by turning it into a polis. And we think, so this is a tremendous upheaval in the nature of the city. So here you have a high priest collaborating with the monarchy in Syria. You have the locals now turning their city into a polis. When the king, now something interesting happens. When the king ascended and Jason came to office, he at once shifted his countrymen over to the Greek way of life. Here you see this Hellenismos, right? The priests were, and so, very often, well, we'll get to this. The priests were no longer intent upon their service at the altar. Despising the sanctuary and neglecting the sacrifices, they hastened to take part in the unlawful proceedings in the wrestling arena after the call of the discus. In other words, 2 Maccabees knows what's going on in these Greek cities, right? They go to some sort of athletic activity, and you can imagine, and we know this, of course, they weren't overly dressed in that, right? And it appears that some tried to hide the very fact of their circumcision. 2 Maccabees describes how this begins to influence the local priesthood, the young priesthood. I always imagined 2 young priests walking near the Temple Mount, right? But of course, on the other side of the hill, there is now a stadium, right? And there's a gymnasium, and we all know what's going on there. And one of the priests tells his colleague, have you been to this stadium yet? This abomination, it's terrible, it's disgusting, it's an atrocity. They disrobe there and do all of these terrible things, and there might even be references to a pagan deity. It's awful, you have to see it, right? In other words, there is a certain group dynamic here, right, where one person arouses the curiosity of another, and people that were originally adhered to the Judaismos, right, now suddenly are involved, right? It's a slippery slope, and people start to be attracted to. And remember, Hellenism was attractive, it was pervasive, and it was open. This is very interesting. We tend to forget this, that there was no ethnic barrier to becoming a Greek. There's a wonderful story told by a Greek that I didn't bring in last week's lecture, a fellow by the name of Klearchos of Soli, and he describes how his mentor, Aristotle, once met a Jew, and they got into a discussion, and Aristotle says, this Jew, Hellenikos en ute dialektoi monon alakai te psyche. Right. He says, this Jew, he's a Jew, Hellenikos, and he was Hellenic, ute, not by virtue of dialektoi monon, only by virtue of his dialect, ala, ella, but kai also, te psyche, by virtue of his psyche, by virtue of his, what should we call it, right, his soul. In other words, if you speak Greek, if you think Greek, you are a Greek. And nobody cares who your grandmother was. And so it's not just pervasive and attractive, but it's assimilatory. And this is what's taking place now in Jerusalem, according to 2 Maccabees. And this will ultimately be the cause for the initial rebellion. Because look what happens in source number 12. After a period of 3 years, Jason, the high priest, sent Menelaus, the brother of the previously mentioned Simon, to carry the money to the king. Remember, they're paying off the king yearly for this, and to complete the records of essential business. But he, the messenger, Menelaus, when presented to the king, secured the high priesthood for himself, outbidding Jason by 300 talents of silver. In other words, the priesthood now is up for sale. We used to talk about, Jason being a moderate Hellenist and Menelaus being an extreme Hellenist. It's sort of, like, I don't know what that means, modern. It's like, extreme terrorist or something, moderate terrorist and extreme terrorist. And then, of course, this leads to the uprising, the Hasmonean uprising, which spreads to the entire area around Jerusalem. Jerusalem becomes isolated by the forces that are under the control at first of Mattathias and then of Judah Maccabee and his brothers. And ultimately, after a 3-year war from 167 to 134, the Greeks are slowly either removed from Jerusalem or the Greek garrison there is surrounded, and then ultimately the city itself falls to Judah. And then Judah and his brothers said, "Behold, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." And he chose blameless priests. In other words, now you have to look for the kosher priests, right? Because all the others, or many of the others, have gone over to the other side. So he chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place. They deliberated what to do about the altar, which had been profaned. So they tore down the altar and stored the stones. And this is an interesting line. In a convenient place on the temple hill, until there should come a prophet to tell what to do with them. In other words, the underlying assumption of 1 Maccabees, which is written in the land of Israel in Hebrew, is prophecy, ongoing prophecy, no longer exists. When a true prophet appears, he'll tell us what to do with these stones. Let's just put them aside, right, for the time being. That line will reappear in an interesting source that I'll read in a minute. And so they took the stones and they basically now rebuild the sanctuary and the interior and consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels and so on. So this is stage number 2. We saw the first in the Persian period, now in the second, in the Hasmonean period. But here we see that what happened under the Hasmoneans is a direct result of what was established in the Persian period. The centrality of the priesthood, the centrality of the temple, and the priesthood that worships within its midst were placed, as it were, in doubt, and the whole area had been defiled. This was the corrective in the temple that the Hasmoneans had to deal with. But what is interesting is, who was the first Hasmonean high priest? Forget about Mattathias. I know we all say, Bimei Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol, and so on. The fact is, we have no information about Mattathias himself being a high priest. It could be that Yochanan is the high priest. We don't know. According to the books of Maccabees, the first high priest, Hasmonean high priest, is not Judah Maccabee, who died just a few years after the consecration of the temple. The temple was reopened and purified in 164. Judah dies in 160 BCE. He's succeeded by his brother, Jonathan. And Jonathan encounters a very interesting situation of pretenders to the Syrian throne. For every king in Antioch, there's a contender. And Jonathan plays them off one against the other. And we get to source number 14. And Jonathan dwelt in Jerusalem, began to rebuild and restore the city. And Alexander Balas, the king, this is one of the contenders to the throne who actually took over the monarchy for a while, heard of all the promises which the other contender, which Demetrius had sent to Jonathan. In other words, they're vying for Hasmonean support now. And he wrote a letter and sent it to him in the following words. King Alexander, this is strange, this is a Seleucid king, to his brother Jonathan, greetings. Suddenly things have changed and you're my brother, right? Saba had problems with you, but we can get along. We have heard about you, that you were a mighty warrior and worthy to be our friend. And so we have appointed you today to be high priest of your nation. So Jonathan put on the holy garments in the 7th month of the 160th year. This is the year of the Seleucids, meaning 152 BC at the Feast of Tabernacles. The first, and this is the irony, here the Hasmoneans rise up in rebellion because of tampering with the priesthood in the temple, and yet the first Hasmonean high priest, Jonathan, is appointed by the Greek king. To tell you how far we've gone already, the changes that are taking place in Jerusalem, right? Whereas, and now of course, this reality will change under the Hasmoneans who become kings, but it will be restored again when Herod becomes king, and he too will appoint a high priest. And so the high priests, as we head into the latter part of the Second Temple period, are going to lose some of their independence. Under the Hasmoneans, not quite. And then we find, source number 15, the last of the Hasmonean brothers, Simon. It's under Simon who comes to, I don't want to say the throne, he wasn't the king, but comes to lead the people beginning in the year 142 BCE. And a year later, 141, he really removes the last vestiges of Greek control in the land of Israel, and there was even a Greek garrison in Jerusalem that was now removed. By the way, if you do go to Ir David, you should know that there used to be a big parking lot that now has been excavated in the last 10 years. It was known as, what was the name? Right, Givati, right? Just opposite Shar HaAshpot, just opposite the Dung Gate. And it could be, that's what archaeologists are telling us now, that that's where that Greek garrison, right, existed adjacent to the Temple Mount. Under Simon, the garrison was removed so that true independence takes place. And then we hear of a major gathering on the Temple Mount of all the representatives of the Jewish people, the king, the priests and the elders, etc., etc. And they want to thank Simon and his family for all that they've done for the people. And the bottom line is this: and the Jews and their priests decided that Simon should be their leader and the high priest. And by the way, if you look at the end of the line, he becomes high priest and commander of the army and ethnarch of the people. He basically becomes what? You can call it king, you can call it by a less attractive name, right? In other words, some people would say despot, some people would say, autocrat, whatever, right? He becomes a sole ruler, not just the priest, but the commander of the army and the leader of the people. But if you go back to the line I was reading, and this is one of my favorite lines, he will become their leader and high priest forever. And I imagine that when that word forever was written down or declared on the Temple Mount, a lot of eyebrows shot up. What? One man, high priest, governor, general, all in one? Right? We never heard of this before. You're either a priest or a king. Since when did the two come together? And then comes, and forever? And then comes the magic word: until a trustworthy prophet should arrive. I call this, in other words, there must have been people who wanted to break away. Now, it could be that when this takes place, indeed, there were those who broke away and ran off to where? Maybe to Qumran. Because it's at this time that we begin to encounter the first appearance of what we will recognize as the Dead Sea sect. In other words, some people maybe could not appreciate this. But the Hasmoneans were brilliant. And so what do they immediately insert? Anybody today in modern Israel recognizes this, right? It's the coalition phrase. It's the phrase that keeps the coalition together. And what is it? This is all temporary. Don't worry. This is all provisional. Now, anybody who lives in Israel knows that there is nothing as permanent as provisional, right, statements, right, or established behavior, right? But what is supposedly temporary ultimately becomes fixed. But that's the brilliant line. Because look at the juxtaposition of two words: forever, until, right? In other words, what you have here is an attempt to create a new type of leadership where the priesthood now, I won't say is subservient to a different leadership, but it is part of a broader leadership. And the temple now, of course, takes on a different image. The third case of a rebuilding of the temple takes place years later. To be more precise, I said in the days of Herod, around the year 19, or he begins the project in the year 19 BC. I could stand here and talk about Herod forever. I hope last year you got to the Herod exhibition at the Israel Museum, right? Herod, of course, is unique. He's a king. The question is he a Jewish king? And of course, that question is not all that, the answer is not that simple. Jewish in terms of, does he make a minion? Yes. If indeed his grandfather, Antipas, converted to Judaism, by whatever system existed at the time, we won't go into that, right? But clearly, he is considered Jewish in a technical sense. So I could call him a Jewish king. But he's not a Jewish monarch in the sense of Jewish monarchy. His monarchy was a Roman innovation from day one. And it had nothing to do with Israelite monarchy or Davidic monarchy, right? And as a result, he's king, but of course his background was known to all, although we're going to see an interesting line in a minute. He could certainly not serve as priest. But he does something else. He embarks on what he will tell us is his greatest undertaking of all, the rebuilding of the temple. And this is source number 16. This is a fascinating source. It describes how Herod, having done all sorts of wonderful things, and you have to understand, he reached his position because Rome ultimately was convinced he can provide the goods. And the goods for Rome is one thing, law and order. Not necessarily in that sequence, right? Order, right? More than anything else. And whereas the Hasmoneans were always suspect as trying to achieve too much independence, they knew that Herod was their man, the right man in the right place. He will maintain order for us. Herod was unique. He was not a high priest. Did that enhance his status or limit his status in Judea? Your natural assumption, based on everything we've seen today, is to say it would limit his status because the priesthood was so central. For Herod, it was just the opposite. The fact that he was not a high priest enhanced his status. Why? Because we tend to forget that the land of Israel was populated not just by Jews. It was populated by Jews, by Greeks, by Syrians, by Samaritans, by Idumeans, by a wide spread of different groups. Herod projects himself as, I'll use the phrase, king of greater Palestine. But he projects himself as what you and I would call today a secular king, in the sense of, had he been high priest, yes, Jews might have respected him. All the other entities, right, ethnic entities, religious entities in the land would have considered him to be an alien. He supports the Jews. By his maintaining a secular image, he can be king to everyone. And indeed, that's what Herod does. He can build the temple for the Jews, but at the very same time, does this make him any more Jewish? He can build Caesarea in honor of Augustus, right? And even have pagan temples in Caesarea. And he doesn't consider this to be a contradiction in terms. This is the uniqueness of Herod, that he is king of the land of Judea, but not necessarily king in a Davidic sense of king of the Jews. And so Josephus describes how in the this is source number 16, in the 18th year of his reign, I gave you the date here, Herod undertook an extraordinary work, namely the reconstructing of the temple of God at his own expense, enlarging its precincts and raising it to a more imposing height. For he believed, now, this is Josephus in a wonderful insight. Is he doing this because he's such a wonderful Jew? Josephus every now will tell us the truth. No, he's doing it for his own aggrandizement, in other words, to establish a name for himself. For he believed that the accomplishment of this task would be the most notable of all the things achieved by him, as indeed it was, and would be great enough to assure his eternal remembrance. That's not necessarily negative. You could say Jews would remember him. But now comes a wonderful description. Since he knew that the populace was not prepared for or easy to enlist in so great an undertaking, he thought it best to predispose them to set to the work on the whole project by making a speech to them first. And so he called together and spoke as follows. And now comes Herod's speech on the eve of the project. Okay, Josephus lived way after this. Right? This is taking place in the 1st century BCE. Josephus will only be born some 40, 50, 60 years later. Right? He wasn't there. How does he know the speech? And he's going to quote it. It's right, verbatim. But of course, what Josephus is doing is what he did throughout his work, what any self-respecting Hellenistic historian would have done, beginning with the days of Thucydides, who tells us in his Peloponnesian War, I couldn't be everywhere to record every speech that was issued, and so I wrote down the speeches that should have been made at any given time. And my students would always scream out, this isn't history, this is psychohistory or something like that. What kind of history is this? And I had to argue with them that this is sometimes more historical than a recording of what was really said. Because this history is not just what happened, but it's why it happened. And so I have the speech of Elazar ben Yair at Masada describing why we should all commit suicide rather than fall in the hands of the Romans. Josephus, if they all committed suicide, how did Josephus get the speech, right? But of course, Josephus knew what motivated these people, and he felt, right, capable of writing a speech that would articulate the beliefs of those people at Masada, why they did what they did. That's real history. And Josephus apparently knows how Herod tried to convince the people, and there might have been certain descriptions that came down to him. But he gives us the speech, which again, of course, he wrote in his study in Rome decades later. And so Herod said as follows, so you see why I like this speech. So far as the other things achieved during my reign are concerned, my countrymen, I consider it unnecessary to speak of them, although they were of such a kind that the prestige which comes from them to me is less than the security which they have brought to you. In other words, everything I've done for you. Every politician should learn this speech by heart, right? For in the most difficult situations, I have not been unmindful of the things that might benefit you in your need, and I think that by the will of God, I have brought the Jewish nation to such a state of prosperity as it has never known before. You know, this is not totally untrue. He was a despot. He was a cruel ruler who annihilated anybody that opposed his rule. And yet the flip side of the coin is, I could use a well-known phrase, the trains ran on time in the days of Herod. In other words, there was a financial prosperity as such. And one aspect which is critical is people had jobs. We're going to see next week what happens when unemployment sets in. But forget about that. Now comes the interesting part of the speech. But the enterprise which I now propose to undertake is the most pious and beautiful one of our time. For this was the temple which our fathers built to the most great God after their return from Babylon. But it lacks 60 cubits in height, the amount by which the first temple built by Solomon exceeded it. A temple that our fathers built. Now, come on. Herod is an Edomian. His grandfather was worshiping in the temple, in the Edomian temples just a few years earlier. And I always imagined that this great gathering of Jews on the Temple Mount, when he said, our fathers built this temple, somebody in the last rows started laughing. I can also imagine that within a few minutes, that somebody wasn't there anymore. Because that's how Herod ran his country, right? People who crossed the king would vanish, according to Josephus, would either vanish to the fortress of Hyrcania. You know where the fortress of Hyrcania is. If you drive down to Jericho, near Nebi Musa, just before you reach Jericho, there's a turn off to the right. And it says Hyrcania, and that's where Josephus tells us people vanished in the days of Herod, never to be seen again. Or they were sold into slavery. But our fathers who built the temple, etc., it lacks 60 cubits, and yet no one should condemn our fathers for neglecting their pious duty. For it was not their fault that this temple is smaller. Rather, it was Cyrus and Darius, the son of Hystaspes, who prescribed these dimensions for the building. By the way, this is cute. In other words, who is the arch enemy of Rome in the East at this time? The Parthians, right? The successors to the Persians. They're the bad guys. So Darius, and Cyrus, to whom we really should thank for rebuilding the temple, now become the people who wouldn't let us build the temple properly. And since our fathers were subject to them and their descendants, and after them to the Macedonians, meaning the Greeks, they had no opportunity to restore their first archetype of piety to its former size. But since by the will of God I am now ruler, and there continues to be a long period of peace, this is what I meant by trains going on time, there was, and an abundance of wealth and great revenues. And now he inserts a line which is, in a sense, very true. What is of most important, the Romans, who are, so to speak, the master of the world, are my loyal friends. I will try to remedy the oversight. What he's telling them is something very interesting, and this is his policy throughout. I can get things from the Romans that nobody else can achieve. This is a window of opportunity to rebuild the temple, because they will allow me to do what they won't allow anyone else. And there's a degree of truth to that. One of Herod's allies is none other than the Roman Emperor Augustus, after whom Herod named two cities. Caesarea is Augustus Caesar, and Sebaste, right, near Shechem, is Sebastos in Greek. Sebastos in Greek is Augustus in Latin, right? In other words, Augustus is my friend. Now, Augustus knew who he was dealing with. And there's a well-known statement attributed to Augustus after Herod kills off a number of his children. You know, at different times in his life, he killed his wife and his children and so on, right? And Augustus makes the famous statement, better to be the pig of Herod than to be the son of Herod. In other words, Herod's a Jew. He'd never slaughter a pig. It's not kosher. His sons, he would slaughter, right? By the way, it's a play on words. The word for pig in Greek is ios, and for son is hios, right? In other words, it's a play on word, but it tells you something about the alliance between Herod and the Romans. The Romans knew what they were dealing with, but they were willing to look the other way because he supplied the goods. And as a result, he could receive from them what no one else can. And so I will try to remedy the oversight, etc., by making this gift of the kingdom to God. Now, how did the Jews accept this? On the one hand, it's Herod. On the other hand, they seem to have embraced it. And there's an interesting source that appears both in Josephus and in rabbinic literature. Now, you have to understand something. The rabbis, there's a long section on Herod in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Bava Batra, page 3b over to 4a. And it begins with Herod annihilating all of, we are told he was a slave of the Hasmoneans, which is a cute way of saying that the Idumeans got into the Hasmonean court, as it were, through the back door, right? Herod's father, Antipater, becomes an advisor to one of the last Hasmonean rulers, and as a result, the Talmud can call him a slave of the Hasmoneans, who killed all of the Hasmonean family, save for one woman, apparently an allusion to Mariam, right, whom he marries, but according to the Talmudic source, she goes up onto a roof, proclaims, I am the last descendant of the Hasmoneans. Anybody who claims that he or she is a Hasmonean henceforth is lying. I'm the last one. And then she throws herself off the roof. In other words, commits suicide. And Herod preserves her body in honey. And there are all sorts of strange descriptions of Herod as really being almost deranged and totally wicked. And one of the rabbis approaches him and says, you deserve such and such. And Herod says, how can I repent for what I've done? And he says, I'm going to the bottom line, basically rebuild the temple. That will be one way of maybe repenting. And Herod goes about it. The only problem being, right, how do you build a new temple without destroying what already exists? And all of this develops out of a Talmudic discussion. Can you destroy a synagogue to build a better synagogue on the same site? And that Talmudic discussion goes to the issue, how could Herod have built a temple without destroying what already existed? And there's a discussion there how he prepared the material in advance, according to Josephus, so that people know that he's really serious. But Josephus, source 17, says the following. It said that during the time when the temple was being built, no rain fell during the day, but only at night, so that there was no interruption of the work. In other words, right, the celestial powers assisted in the rebuilding of the temple by not having it rain during the day, only at night. And this story, which our fathers have handed down to us, is not at all incredible, if that is the other manifestation of power given by God. Such then was the way in which the temple was rebuilt. In other words, it only rained at night, not during the day, which is exactly what source 18 tells us. Likewise, we find in the days of Herod, when the people were occupied with the rebuilding of the temple, rain fell during the night, but in the morning the wind blew, the clouds dispersed, the sun shone, so that people were able to go out to their work. And then they knew that they were engaged in sacred work. Now, this is very strange. In other words, Herod clearly should have been projected in the most negative way by the rabbis. And yet, when it came to the building of the temple, somehow an alternative source manages to find its way into, what shall I call it, national memory. He did one good thing in his lifetime, right? He built the temple. So much so that source 19 tells us, he who has not seen the temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building. In other words, here they were willing to accede to this event. And we have another 3 minutes left. I want to point out on page number 6, another important aspect of the temple that, as I said, has its roots in the days of Nehemiah, but continues throughout the Second Temple period. But we don't know quite from when the issue of machatzit shekel, the half shekel, begins. What we do know is that somewhere in the crossover from the Hellenistic to the Roman period, we begin to encounter evidence of Jews, not just of Israel, but of the diaspora, sending money to the temple. To make a long story short, Jews will be required to send their shkalim at a given time of the year. The money, the proclamation goes out in the month of Adar. People start sending in money so that it arrives beginning by the month of Nisan, the first month of the monthly cycle of years. And all of the new sacrifices must be taken from these funds. What I've done is I've collected here a number of sources that describe how the funds were sent. The most interesting one is source number 21, where we are told of a story that takes place just 2 years after the Romans conquered Judea. Pompey conquers in 63, and a year or two later, we're told that the Roman governor of Asia Minor, Flaccus, tried to prevent Jews from sending money to the Temple of Jerusalem. Cicero, and the Jews bring this fellow Flaccus to trial in Rome, and Cicero becomes an attorney on behalf of Flaccus, defending him. And we have the speech that Cicero made as a book known as Prof, where Cicero enumerates how much money was sent by Jews. How did the Romans look upon this? Clearly, if the Jews from all over Italy and the rest of the Roman Empire sent money, it means Jews have what? Dual loyalties. Right? They may not be loyal to us. And Tacitus, the Roman historian, 100 years later, more than that, tells us that the customs of the Jews are base and abominable and owe their persistence to their depravity. For the worst rascals among other people, renouncing their ancestral religion, meaning converting to Judaism, what's the first thing they do? Always kept sending tribute and contributing to Jerusalem. Thereby, now comes the well-known phrase, increasing the wealth of the Jews. And that phrase, we have to understand something. The wealth of the Jews, Tacitus was taught, beginning with the Renaissance, it became a staple of the educational curriculum throughout Western Europe. When you studied Latin, you studied Tacitus. So that every child, every high school child, in much of the Middle Ages would have read these sources by Tacitus describing, right, the depravity of the Jews and the fact that they send money elsewhere. They are, right, they don't adhere to the laws of the nation and so on. The temple, thus, becomes central in the life of the Jews, but at the very same time, and this goes back to what we saw last week, at the very same time, the Greeks and Romans look at that temple and they say it's such a central factor in Jewish life, not just for the Jews of Judea, but for world Jewry. But of course, the other side of that coin is that is what renders them so dangerous. And ultimately, that will bring about the events that we're going to describe in next week's lecture. So we'll stop here. I'm glad I managed to fit all of this into an hour and a half, right? Well, we'll talk about this next week, okay?